This is the beginning of the second podcast on Chapter 11. We're continuing about summative assessment. How are these two types of summative evaluation different? We have norm referenced summative assessment and we have criterion referenced summative assessment. Norm referenced is when you evaluate students in terms of what other students can do. The best example is FitnessGram, where we compare students' scores from FitnessGram according to national norms. Another example in physical education are the AFERD skills tests. We have skills tests from AFERD in just about every sport skill category that there is. Then there are criterion reference tests, which assess students according to the extent to which they have achieved the objective the teacher has established for the test. Some examples are teacher-made tests and PE metrics, which is a type of assessment battery done by AFERD. But most teacher-made tests are according to the objectives specifically for that class, and that's why they're criterion referenced assessments. The purpose for assessment, both normative referenced and criterion referenced assessment, is for student grades, evaluating instruction, and for accountability purposes. Good assessment measures have four different types of characteristics. First of all, they have to be valid. They have to measure what they are supposed to measure or what they purport to measure. They need to be reliable or consistent over time. If I give a test one day to a class and I give it to the same class the next day, they should get the same results. It needs to also be objective and not be void of bias. In other words, different evaluators would get the same score if you're using observational data or if they were taking a test of yours. It needs to be practical. They need to be easy to administer and not take a lot of time out of the instructional process. When we're talking about validity and reliability, there are things to remember. Validity is the authenticity of the test. In other words, does it have content validity, where experts have checked to make sure that they think that the content in the test is valid? Or is it criterion related validity? In other words, you've taken a test, and to make sure that it's valid, you've compared it to another test that measures the same thing. The best example of criterion related validity or comparison validity is the FitnessGram test. We take the FitnessGram test of PACER and compare it, and it has been compared to the VO2 max test in an exercise physiology lab, and they have come up with very similar results. The correlation is very high between those two. Reliability is, of course, the consistency or objectivity of the test, and that's important also. Making assessments valid and reliable means that you need to do several things. The assessment needs to be related to the objectives of the course or the objectives of the unit or the lesson. The assessment needs to have the criteria on it defined clearly. You need to make specific levels of performance within the assessment. You need to practice using the tool in the class and revise it several times, and also check the reliability of tests by scoring it many times with different classes to see if you get the same results. When we collect information or do assessments, it can be a formal assessment or evaluation, which we also consider to be what we call standardized or formal, and sometimes those tests, or most of the time those tests, have validity and reliability. Or it can be an informal assessment or evaluation, which is more observational and a little more informal, as the name suggests. Examples of formal evaluation are skills tests, written tests, records of performance, videotaped analysis, win-loss records, and FitnessGram or other fitness tests. Informal evaluation examples are rating scales, descriptions of performance, checklists, student journals, student interviews, self-testing, or peer assessment. Many people think that formal evaluation is also summative evaluation, But if you look at the examples underneath formal evaluation, records of performance and videotaped analysis are not summative types of assessments. Videotaped analysis is often done during the process of teaching. Under informal evaluation, many people get this confused with formative assessment. But as you can see, rating scales can be used for summative purposes, as well as student journals can be used for summative performance if the journals are using prompts that are being graded. Formal evaluation is used when more reliable and valid measures are needed. Trying to assess Standard 1 or NASPE Standard 1 about psychomotor objectives, skills tests can be used to measure Standard 1. Most of the skill tests are done in closed environments and they are testing skills in isolation. Written tests are more formal evaluations and they evaluate Standard 2 of NASPE's standards, because Standard 2 is about cognitive information in physical education, and that's what we use written tests for. Fitness tests we use as formal evaluation, and they are to measure Standard 3 for NASPE, which is about health-related fitness and physical activity. The fitness tests test the 5 components of health-related fitness: cardiorespiratory endurance, muscular strength, flexibility, and body composition. Fitness tests should be administered on a regular basis throughout the school year, instead of once at the beginning of the year and once at the end. The following slides on this podcast talk about informal or more observational assessments. Alternative assessments are also called authentic assessments. They're meaningful and they represent real-life learning. They emphasize very higher level thinking. They articulate the criteria in advance, or teachers articulate the criteria for these assessments in advance. We also try to embed these assessments within instruction. We emphasize a public display of student work sometimes of these authentic assessments because they're not used for a summative purpose, and they involve the process and the product of learning. Some examples of alternative assessments are checklists and rating scales. We call these alternative assessments because they are not the traditional assessments that we've done forever and a day in physical education, such as written tests and skills tests. Checklists are more authentic and meaningful because they are yes/no types of scales. They're easy to score and they are observational in nature. We don't make any judgments about the level of quality of the skill. We just see if the criteria is present or not present. We also list desirable actions or critical elements within the checklist and whether they are present or not. Rating scales are used to determine the degree of the action that exists. It's useful for self and peer assessment, and it's very good for prescribing instruction and giving feedback, and also for giving students the criteria of what they're going to be assessed on. If you give them the rating scale at the beginning of the unit and show them what they're going to be assessed on at the end, they can use that rating scale as a guide for their practice. Scoring rubrics are more formal types of assessments. They are used for complex behavior or performance, things like gameplay rubrics. The process of developing rubrics are to define the task, to list the criteria or the critical elements of that skill or task, and establish levels of performance. We share the rubrics with learners first, and they are not used for motor skills only. They are sometimes used for affective domain as well as the cognitive domain. Scoring rubrics help teachers define what is excellent, and it defines the level of performance that you want your students to be at. Some guidelines for writing rubrics are: what you need to do is visualize the expected student performance. What does a student look like in the 8th grade class when they're trying to do a volleyball set? You need to write down the key components of what a good or excellent uh, performance at the 8th grade level would be and what the descriptors would be. Then you need to create standards or levels of performance. Usually we use 3 or more levels of performance for rubrics. Refine the rubric prior to first use, then administer the assessment or use the rubric in class, then revise it again. And we usually go through this refine, use, revise cycle for about 3 or 4 times before we actually use a rubric, especially for using it for a grade and summative purposes. That's the end of Podcast 2 for Chapter 11.